Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're here to really dig into some of the most complex, sometimes agonizing stories, trying to get to the objective truth.
And today, we're looking at a case that's just haunted Austin, Texas for decades. It's the 1991 quadruple homicide at the I can't believe it's yogurt shop.
Yeah, it's a case that's infamous not just for the crime itself, which was horrific, but for this incredibly long, twisted path to, well, some kind of resolution.
Exactly. We're talking 34 years, wrongful convictions, major legal issues, and finally, science stepping in really in the last decade or so to unravel it.
So our mission today is to unpack all of that. The investigation, where it went wrong, the legal battles, and how advanced forensics ultimately pointed to the truth.
It's a really stark example of how investigations can fail, sometimes catastrophically, but also how they can eventually be corrected.
Okay, let's set the scene. December 6th, 1991, Austin. It was a Friday night.
Around 11 p.m. Central Time.
Yeah.
And the victims. It's just heartbreaking. 4 teenage girls. We have to remember their names.
Absolutely. Amy Ayers, she was only 13. Sarah Harbison, 15. And then Eliza Thomas and Jennifer Harbison, both 17. They worked at the shop.
Right, and Jennifer was Sarah's older sister. Eliza and Jennifer were closing up. Sarah and Amy were just there, waiting for a ride home together.
Just a normal Friday night ending, supposed to be.
Until it wasn't. The discovery came just before midnight. A patrol officer saw smoke, reported a fire at the yogurt shop.
And when first responders arrived, it wasn't just a fire.
No, it was, a truly horrific scene. Mass shooting, murder, evidence of rape, arson, femicide. It was clear the fire was set deliberately to destroy evidence.
Suggesting a level of planning, not just panic.
Definitely. An attempt to erase everything, everyone.
Okay, let's dig into the mechanics of the crime itself, because the details suggest, like you said, planning and control. It's chilling.
It really is. The investigators believed it started after a man asked to use the restroom, back near closing time.
Okay.
And the theory is he either hid back there or possibly jammed the back door so accomplices could get in later.
Right, because there was that couple, wasn't there? Leaving just before 11, they saw two men inside, acting. Weirdly.
Yeah, furtively, nervously. That definitely points towards maybe more than one person being involved. Coordination.
And that coordination, that control, you see it in how the girls died.
Tragically, yes. All four were shot in the head. The reports called it execution style.
Which implies they were subdued first, positioned, maybe kneeling.
Exactly. Not a chaotic struggle resulting in shots, but something methodical. And the weapons involved. That's interesting, too.
What did they find there?
Evidence pointed to two different guns being used. A .22 firearm and a .380 pistol.
Two guns. Okay.
But the final, fatal shots, the execution-style ones, those were all from a .22 caliber lead bullet.
So multiple weapons possibly on scene fits with the idea of multiple attackers, maybe?
It certainly strengthens that theory.
Yeah.
And then the state of the victims. It's incredibly disturbing.
Tell us about that, the specific conditions.
Well, Sarah, Eliza, and Jennifer, they were gagged and bound with their own underwear. Then, horrifically, they were severely burned in the fire, shot in the back of the
The fire clearly meant to destroy any trace evidence. Fingerprints, fibers, DNA.
Maximize destruction, absolutely. But Amy Ayers, the youngest, she was found separately. Her situation was a bit different.
How so?
Her body wasn't in the main charred area, but she did have very severe burns, second and even early third degree, over about 25–30% of her body.
Okay. And something else.
Yes, there was a sock-like cloth found tied around her neck, suggesting maybe an attempt at strangulation or further binding. And tragically, the details about her gunshot wounds.
What about that?
The initial shot, the execution-style one, actually missed her brain. It seems she was shot a second time, and that was the fatal wound.
Wow. That speaks to a chilling determination. Not just killing, but making sure.
Exactly. Cold, methodical.
Yeah.
Even when the first attempt failed.
So you have this controlled scene, the bindings, the specific shots, the arson to destroy evidence.
Right. All of it screamed organized to the initial APD detectives. They immediately thought, this wasn't done by kids.
Their first assumption was adults.
Experienced adults. People who knew how to commit crimes, control victims, and cover their tracks. They were quite firm on that early on.
And that initial assumption, that bias almost, becomes really important later, doesn't it?
Critically important. It shaped how they viewed early leads.
But amidst all the destruction, they did collect something vital, even if they didn't know its full potential yet.
Yes, absolutely crucial. They collected male DNA from a vaginal swab taken from one of the victims.
The arson didn't destroy everything.
No, that biological evidence survived. But, 1991, DNA technology was still developing, so this key piece of evidence just sat there for years.
Waiting, while the investigation took some very different turns.
Exactly.
It's interesting how they handled immediate leads then. There was that 16-year-old kid caught nearby with a .22, right? Same caliber.
Right. Just days later, he and 3 of his friends, none older than 17,
Yeah.
brought in and questioned.
But dismissed quickly.
Very quickly. Because the detectives were so locked into their experienced adult theory, they basically figured the kid was just trying to dodge a gun charge.
So they downplayed the gun, anything the teens might have said.
Yeah, saw them as irrelevant, maybe opportunistic kids, not serious suspects. It was a huge blind spot, a really devastating bias in hindsight.
And then there was the shadow of Kenneth McDuff looming over everything.
You couldn't investigate a crime like this in Texas at that time without considering McDuff, a notorious serial killer known to target teenagers, and he was active in the area.
So they had to rule him out.
They did, relatively quickly. But here's something chilling. McDuff himself actually confessed to the yogurt shop murders.
He confessed when?
On the very day of his execution in 1998. Now, it was likely false, like many confessions in this case.
But it shows how this case just attracted confessions, false leads.
Absolutely. It became this kind of magnetic, high-profile crime that people latched onto, making it incredibly hard for investigators to separate fact from fiction.
Okay, so the initial investigation was kind of hampered by this fixed idea about adult perpetrators. But then the case goes cold. And the next phase, well, it's a complete 180, isn't it?
It really is. Years pass, and then a new detective takes a look at the cold case files.
And decides
That maybe those 4 teenagers, the ones dismissed back in 91, were actually culprits after all. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, Forrest Wellborn, they were in their 20s by then.
So the theory flips completely. Suddenly, these guys are prime suspects.
Exactly. And this is where the investigation takes a truly disastrous turn, focusing entirely on getting confessions from them.
Which they eventually did from Springsteen and Scott. But the way those confessions were obtained, that's the core problem here.
It's the absolute crux of the miscarriage of justice. The issue goes back to those first interviews in 1991.
What about them?
The police didn't record them. No audio, no video, no detailed transcript of what was actually said between the detectives and these teenagers.
And why is that lack of recording so critical years later?
Because it creates an impossible situation. When they reinterrogate Springsteen and Scott years later, there's no way to prove that the detectives didn't feed them key details about the crime back in 91.
You mean details the public wouldn't know? Like how the victims were bound or the specific guns used?
Precisely. Non-public information. If the detectives mentioned those details in 91, even casually, the suspects could later repeat those facts in their formal confessions, making them sound like they had first-hand knowledge.
It sounds like they were guilty.
Right. It's a classic, deeply flawed interrogation technique, whether intentional or not. You give them the info, they parrot it back, and suddenly you have a confession.
That's terrifying. And these confessions were basically the entire case against them.
Entirely. There was no physical evidence linking Springsteen or Scott to the crime scene. None. The convictions rested solely on these self-incriminating statements.
And based on that alone, they went to trial.
Yes, both were convicted of capital murder. Springsteen got the death penalty initially.
Which was later commuted, right? Because
Yeah.
he was a minor at the time of the crime.
Correct. Due to the Supreme Court's Roper v. Simmons ruling in 2005, which banned the death penalty for crimes committed under 18. So his sentence became life. Michael Scott also received a life sentence.
Over a decade of their lives gone, based on confessions that were shaky at best.
Deeply, deeply flawed. And the personnel involved just adds another layer of concern.
You're talking about Detective Hector Polanco.
Yes, his involvement in these interrogations is a major red flag.
Why specifically him? Did he have a history?
He absolutely did. Polanco had been previously accused, quite strongly, of coercing false confessions in another very high-profile, notorious wrongful conviction case.
Which one was that?
The case of Christopher Ochoa and Richard Danziger. They were also exonerated after serving, I think, 13 years for a murder they didn't commit, largely based on confessions Polanco helped obtain.
Wow, so a pattern.
A documented pattern. And the Ochoa Danziger case had its own tragic postscript. Richard Danziger was assaulted in prison and suffered severe permanent brain damage.
It just underscores the real-world consequences. This isn't just legal theory, it's people's lives being destroyed.
Exactly. And allowing a detective with that kind of history to lead interrogations in another major capital case It's just astounding. It shows a systemic failure to learn from past mistakes.
And it highlights the incredible danger of relying so heavily on confessions, right? Especially when you consider how many people confess to this crime.
Over 50 people, the Austin police themselves admitted this, including Kenneth McDuff, as we mentioned. There was another confession in '92 from two Mexican nationals that was also quickly found to be false.
So dozens of confessions floating around.
That sheer volume should have screamed caution. It should have told investigators to distrust all confessions and rely solely on hard, physical evidence.
Which they technically had.
They had the DNA. The most reliable piece of evidence, pointing to an unknown male, was sitting right there. But they ignored it, choosing instead to build a case around these coerced narratives.
It's just backward. An initial bias dismissing the teens, followed by an opposite bias clinging to confessions from those same individuals, obtained by a problematic detective, all while ignoring the science.
A perfect storm for a miscarriage of justice.
Okay, so Springsteen and Scott are convicted, imprisoned for years. But then the appeals process starts to gain traction, and science finally gets its say.
Right. This is where the tide finally begins to turn. First, Springsteen's conviction was overturned in 2006. The grounds were essentially an unfair trial.
Okay, so procedural issues initially.
Yes, and then the big one came in 2008. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned both convictions, Springsteen's and Scott's.
And what was the specific legal reason that time? It wasn't just unfair trial, was it?
No, this was a major constitutional issue. The court ruled that the prosecution had violated the Sixth Amendment's Confrontation Clause.
The Confrontation Clause. Remind us what that guarantees.
Basically, it gives a defendant the right to confront and cross-examine the witnesses against them, to challenge their testimony in open court.
And how is that violated here?
Because the prosecution had used parts of Scott's alleged confession against Springsteen and parts of Springsteen's alleged confession against Scott.
Ah, so they were using the co-defendants' statements against each other.
Exactly. But since neither Scott nor Springsteen testified at the other's trial, their lawyers never got the chance to cross-examine the source of that damaging testimony. The statements came in, but the person who supposedly made them couldn't be challenged on the stand.
That's a fundamental violation of their trial rights.
A clear violation. And that was the legal basis for overturning both convictions in 2008.
But the real turning point, the thing that made the case truly unravel, was the DNA, wasn't it?
Absolutely. That same year, 2008, the defense lawyers pushed for DNA testing on that vaginal swab collected way back in 1991.
And the results?
A bombshell. The male DNA profile developed from the swab did not match Robert Springsteen. It did not match Michael Scott. It did not match Maurice Pierce or Forrest Wellborn.
It didn't match any of the four men who had been the focus for so long.
None of them. The DNA belonged to a completely unknown male. The person who left that crucial biological evidence was someone else entirely.
Let's talk about the specific science here. They used YSTR testing. Why was that particular method so important?
Okay, so standard DNA testing, STR analysis, looks at markers across all chromosomes, which is great, but when you have a mixed sample, like from a sexual assault, containing DNA from both the victim and the assailant, standard STR results can be really complex, sometimes hard to definitively separate.
Right, it's like trying to hear one voice in a noisy room.
That's a good analogy. YSTR testing gets around that. It focuses only on the Y chromosome, which is passed down almost unchanged from father to son.
And since the female victim wouldn't have a Y chromosome.
Exactly. The YSTR test isolates and profiles only the male DNA in the sample. It cuts through the victim's DNA noise and gives you a clear profile of the male contributor.
And in this case, it confirmed.
It confirmed the presence of one single unknown male donor. Not multiple donors, just one man whose DNA was on the victim and who wasn't Scott or Springsteen or Pierce or Wellborn.
The science was unambiguous.
Completely.
Yeah.
So finally, in June 2009, after spending over a decade locked up for a crime the DNA proved they likely didn't commit, Scott and Springsteen were released on bond.
Finally free. But the legal wrangling wasn't quite over, was it? The DA at the time, Rosemary Lemberg, she had a tough decision.
A massive dilemma. She publicly acknowledged the DNA pointed to this single unknown male. She delayed scheduling a retrial, saying she needed to figure out who this mystery donor was before seeking the full truth.
Which sounds reasonable, but wait. She still seemed to cling to the idea the confessions were valid, didn't she?
She did. Even with the DNA excluding them, Lemberg maintained that the original statements from Scott and Springsteen were voluntary.
How is that possible? If the DNA proves someone else was there, how can you still give weight to confessions obtained under such dubious circumstances by that detective?
It shows the incredible psychological power a confession holds,
Mm.
even for prosecutors. It's like the narrative becomes more real than the physical evidence. A reluctance, maybe, to admit the system failed so completely.
But ultimately, the science was too strong to ignore.
Undeniable. In October 2009, all charges against Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen were formally dismissed.
Freedom, but the aftermath for them, it's still incredibly complicated and unjust in many ways.
It really is. And this highlights a specific, often cruel, aspect of the justice system, especially around compensation for the wrongly convicted.
They weren't compensated for the years they lost.
No. Texas courts later ruled they weren't entitled to compensation.
But why? The charges were dismissed, the DNA cleared them. How can they not get compensation?
It's a frustrating legal loophole. Under Texas law at the time, you weren't automatically eligible for compensation just because your conviction was overturned or charges were dismissed. You needed something more.
What more?
You generally needed the state to formally declare you actually innocent. Just having the case fall apart because of new evidence, like DNA, wasn't always enough to trigger compensation unless that official declaration of innocence was made.
So the burden was still on them to prove they didn't do it even after the state's case collapsed and the evidence pointed elsewhere.
Essentially, yes. The system didn't automatically grant them that innocent status needed for the compensation, which could have been up to $80,000 per year of wrongful imprisonment. It's a terrible catch-22.
It's just Kafkaesque. And what about the people who put them away? The jurors?
That's another layer of tragedy. 7 jurors from the original trials later went on record saying they would not have voted to convict Scott and Springsteen if they'd known about the DNA evidence back then.
Acknowledging the science would have changed everything.
It underscores how central that flawed confession-based narrative was, and how much the absence of the true physical evidence skewed the outcome.
And we also need to mention Maurice Pierce, the third man implicated alongside Scott and Springsteen.
Yes, his story also ends tragically. In December 2010, about a year after Scott and Springsteen were freed,
What happened?
Pierce was involved in a traffic stop in Austin. It led to a foot chase, a struggle with an officer, where Pierce apparently stabbed the officer survived, and the officer then shot and killed Pierce.
Just another layer of tragedy connected to this whole saga.
Absolutely. While separate from the yogurt shop case itself, his death feels like another sad ripple effect from that initial flawed investigation decades earlier.
So this case, with all its twists and turns, the wrongful convictions, the eventual exoneration, it didn't just stay a local Austin tragedy, did it? It had national repercussion.
It really did. It became a symbol, a powerful case study for why reform was needed, especially regarding cold cases and the use of forensic science.
And that led to actual legislation.
Yes. The Austin yogurt shop murders were cited as a key motivation behind a federal law, the Homicide Victims' Families' Rights Act of 2021. President Biden signed it into law in 2022.
Okay, what does this act actually do? How does it help families?
It essentially gives families of homicide victims more power. It mandates that federal law enforcement agencies have to review cold case files if the family requests it. And importantly, they have to consider applying the latest forensic technology and investigative techniques.
So families aren't just stuck if local police won't revisit a case or use new science.
Exactly. It provides a pathway, building on earlier House Judiciary Committee work, for families to petition the federal government to step in and re-examine cold cases, specifically those older than 3 years. It's a direct response to situations like the yogurt shop case, where potentially solvable crimes languish because of outdated methods or institutional inertia.
A systemic change driven by this specific failure.
Precisely.
Right.
Realizing that sometimes you need that external push, that mandated review with fresh eyes and new tools to correct past errors.
And that push, that new technology, eventually led to the final identification in the yogurt shop case itself, right?
Yeah.
Decades later.
It did. Even though the YSTR test in 2008 proved Scott and Springsteen weren't the source of the DNA, it didn't identify who was. That required another leap in forensic technology.
And that breakthrough came when?
The announcement was made on September 26, 2025. 34 years after the murders, Austin police finally named the man whose DNA was found at the scene.
And the name was?
Robert Eugene Brashers, a known serial killer.
How did they finally link him after all that time? The YSTR profile wasn't in the standard criminal database, presumably.
No, it wasn't. The link was made using investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG. This is the technique that's been solving so many cold cases recently.
That's using public genealogy databases like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
Forensic genealogists, like the well-known C.C. Moore, upload the crime scene DNA profile to these public databases. They're not looking for an exact match, usually.
They're looking for relatives, distant cousins.
Exactly. They find people who share segments of DNA, indicating a familial relationship, maybe third or fourth cousins. Then they use traditional genealogy, building family trees, researching public records to trace forward and backward from those relatives.
Trying to pinpoint someone who fits the profile, age, location, etc.
Right. It's incredibly painstaking work. Brasher's was actually flagged as a potential suspect through IgG as far back as 2018.
Yeah.
It just took several more years to fully confirm the link.
Identified in 2018, confirmed in 2025. So, Robert Brasher's. What happened to him? Could he face justice?
No. That's another bittersweet part of this resolution. Brasher's killed himself back in 1999 during a standoff with police.
So the families get the truth. They know who did it. But there's no trial, no conviction for this crime.
None. The perpetrator was dead long before he was identified. It provides answers, but not the kind of closure the courtroom offers. It's a common outcome in very old cold cases solved by DNA.
But the evidence linking Brasher's confirmed in 2025 is solid now, beyond just the IgG lead.
Extremely solid. First, you have the DNA itself. The partial YSTR profile from the victim swab was confirmed as a partial match to Brasher's own Y-DNA profile. That's the genetic link.
Okay.
But there was more. Physical evidence that had been sitting in storage for decades suddenly became crucial.
What was that?
A bullet casing. It had been recovered from a drain at the yogurt shop back in '91.
And they could finally test it properly?
Yes. Using modern ballistics analysis, they examined the unique markings on that casing. And those markings were consistent with the patterns made by the specific gun Brasher's used to kill himself in 1999.
Wow. So you have his DNA at the scene and a bullet casing matching the gun he possessed years later.
Two completely different types of forensic evidence, genetic and ballistic, both pointing directly at Robert Brasher's. It's about as conclusive as you can get without a confession or eyewitness.
Which again throws the situation of Scott and Springsteen into sharp relief. Science has now definitively identified the perpetrator, someone completely unconnected to them.
Absolutely. They're exonerated by the science multiple times over. No DNA link, no weapon link.
And yet their fight for that official declaration of innocence, for restitution for those stolen years, continues.
It does. Their lawyers remain hopeful, as the reports say. But it highlights that final frustrating gap between scientific certainty and full legal resolution and repair. Even with the killer identified, their struggle within the system isn't over.
Looking back at this whole 34-year saga, it's just staggering, isn't it? The journey from that horrific night in 1991 to identifying Brasher's in 2025.
It really is. And it serves as such a powerful, if painful, lesson about the dangers of relying on coerced confessions over objective scientific evidence.
For years, the official story, the one that sent two men to prison, was based entirely on these shaky statements, while the real evidence, the DNA, sat waiting.
Right. And it took those major advancements in science, first YSCR testing to isolate the unknown profile, then investigated genetic genealogy to finally put a name to that profile to correct the course.
Science literally redefined the truth of what happened in that yogurt shop. It freed the innocent and eventually identified the guilty.
It's a testament to the power of forensic science when it's allowed to speak, when it's prioritized over narrative or convenience or, frankly, investigator bias.
We started with a crime scene deliberately set ablaze to destroy evidence.
And we end with tiny, resilient pieces of evidence, DNA fragments, markings on a bullet casing that survived the fire and the passage of decades to ultimately reveal the truth. It's quite remarkable.
It really is. Which leaves us with a final thought, something for you, our listeners, to mull over.
Yeah, think about restorative justice in a case like this. The actual killer, Robert Brasher's, is long dead. He can't be punished or confronted. So what does justice look like now for the victims' families, knowing who did it but having no trial?
And what does it mean for Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott? Science proved their innocence relative to the key evidence the perpetrator is known, yet they're still fighting for that formal legal acknowledgement for compensation for the years the system failed them.
The physical evidence has finally spoken definitively. But does the legal and human resolution fully match that scientific certainty? It highlights that ongoing tension, doesn't it, between human fallibility, investigative pressures, legal definitions, and the cold, hard facts that science can uncover.
A complex and sobering end to a very long search for truth. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.